Can everyone see this PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Can see.
So today, I'm not sure what you said in your introduction, but I'm guessing everyone knows we're looking at English language specifically today. So we're looking at the VCE Englishes and, which one you should choose, which is like the dilemma all of us face when we go from high school into like VCE specifically, okay? So we're specifically looking to Okay, ready to start. Okay, so the first thing I'll talk about today, so as we're just heading into it, is how the English scaling works and how the whole ATAR works itself, right? So that's one of the important questions we ask when we're trying to work out which English we want to do as students, right? So the ATAR itself, and I'll come back to this as well. It's quite important to know how the score that the ATAR is determined, okay? So the ATAR is the main bulk of the ATAR comes from 4 subjects only. So we have our best subjects, our best 4 subjects, and then they count for the majority of the score. And then we also have 2 10% ones. These 2 at the end are also optional, right? So if you do 6 subjects in VCE, maybe 5 in year 12, and maybe like 1 early entry, the 2 that you do the worst in will be your number 4 and number 5. They only count for 10%, so they don't count too much. Almost all of the score will come from your 4 subjects, your 4 best subjects. The one important thing to notice about this is that one of the 4 has to be an English. So because the Australian government thinks that English is very important in the workplace, they make it compulsory that one of your subjects that counts for your ATAR the most, one of the top 4 subjects, has to be in English. So it's a compulsory subject doing in English, right? Out of the rest, you can pick whatever you want. It doesn't matter. These can be anything. Also, technically, you can't do if you do 3 Englishes or if you do 3 mathematics subjects, all 3. So they can't all count. So that's the only other thing to notice. You can't do all 3 Englishes and have them count in the top 4. Okay. Same for maths. If you do all 3 maths, only 2 of them are allowed to count in number 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, so this is really important. What it means is that doing well in English is very, very, very important. Okay, it's as important as your best subject. So a lot of people who are very science orientated, a lot of kids will do well in their first 3 subjects, but then their English won't be as good, and it will bring down the average score overall. Okay, so the 4 Englishes that you get to choose from are as follows. Mainstream English, which on the list is just called English. So this one, just normal English. Basically, this one is the one in between. You do a little bit of text response, which is reading books and analyzing them. You do a little bit of persuasive language, especially an oral presentation, speaking out loud. You do a little bit of that language. You also do a little bit of analyzing articles. So one of the sections of the exam is analyzing an article one. And you also do a comparative. So mainstream English is the one that most kids do. It's the most popular one. Next, we have literature. This one is for kids who really, really like reading. So I would recommend literature to people who love reading, who are really good at writing about books. Literature, all the marks comes from reading poetry, reading books, and writing like essays about them. So like interpreting essays, interpreting books and poetry and movies and things like that. Literature is the best for kids who are really like reading and are really good at writing about books. I'll come back to English language. That's what we're talking about today. The 4th English is EAL. So this is English as an additional language. If you can qualify for English as an additional language, if you can qualify for EAL, the kids should definitely do it. The way you qualify is you can only do EAL if you've been living in Australia for less than 7 years. Okay, so yeah, if you've been living in Australia for less than 7 years. So for instance, if you maybe came from China in the last 6 years, if the student came, or from anywhere, then they would qualify for EAL, and they should definitely do it because EAL is easier than any of the other Englishes, and they will get a better score in it because they don't scale against are the students who study English first language, which is what most kids do in VCE. Most kids are first language, so EAL is quite a small one. Overall, so today we're going to be talking about English language specifically, because I think a lot of people don't really know what English language is or what it means. So they think, they tend to stick away from it. But it is becoming more popular as a subject, English language is. So we'll come to why I think English language is something you should definitely consider as you're going into VCE, why you should do it, not just for scaling, but also for the skills you get from doing English. So cool, we're heading out into some of the scaling and stuff behind it. The first thing I wanted to point out is that English language is growing as a subject. To compare though, you'll see that it's still quite a small subject. There's 43,000 kids around approximately who do English mainstream, the biggest English. But we'll find out that English language is actually growing. I see people are asking questions in the chat. We'll actually have a Q&A at the end. So after I speak, you'll be able to, I'll answer all your questions, okay? So I'm not ignoring you, I will come back, okay? But yeah, so I just wanted to point out that English language as a subject is growing. Each year there's more and more students, but still it's quite small compared to English mainstream. And I think English language is only for a special type of student. It's not for everyone, okay? And if you're not very interested in it, then yeah, maybe there's a lot of kids who will be better suited to mainstream. But I'll get into all that in a sec. Okay, so remember how I was talking about the ATAR before? This picture you're seeing on the screen right now. It looks very confusing, but this is the breakdown of how the scores for English language in the final exam. So the reason I put this up is because this shows you the average, the number of kids for each score. So if we look here at A plus, we see that out of the kids, approximately maybe 8% of people got an A plus. Out of an A, maybe approximately 10% of people got an A. So that's what this is showing you. And the reason I put this up here is because what I'm interested in telling you is that the English language, for English language, the average is quite spread, okay? So a lot of kids, you'll tend to do, on average, kids do have a broader range of grades. So a lot of kids do English language and do very well at it. So they get the top scores, but there's also more kids who do English language that struggle with the content than in English mainstream, where we have a more like, the distribution is more centered around the middle, okay? So the reason for that is that it scales more, but the subject is actually harder as well. So for kids who find English very, very difficult, English language can also end up getting them a lower score than English mainstream would have. But I would say that if you find English comfortable, and I'll give you some idea about, how to know if you're good at English, you can actually end up with a very, very good score in English language as well. There's a lot of kids who get around the B plus to A plus range, which is a high range for VCE English. So yeah, this is the grade distribution. To understand this is basically the same information here, just in table format. The two arrows refer to the top band, which means that to get in the A plus range on the exam, you have to get at least 114 marks out of 150. So if you do the maths, I think that's something like 75% to get in the A plus range on the exam. This is quite a large range, which means it's not very difficult to get into the A plus range on the exam. If you study hard and work on that, getting into the A plus and A range is quite reasonable. Overall though, the other arrow shows you where the average is. So the median score for English language in the exam is a C plus. So the mark out of 50 that you can get for the study score for English language, the average is around 30 to 35. Sorry, around 30, low 30 to 35. That's the average score, okay? Just a minute on that. The ATAR is out of 100 and it's a percentile, which means that it's ranked. So if you get 99.95, which is the highest ATAR possible, that means you're in the top 0.05%. The study score is basically the same, but it's scaled. So it doesn't necessarily mean you're in the top 15% if you get a 35. It doesn't mean you're in the top 30%, sorry. So the C plus is just the average for Englang. To get onto how the scaling works now, here we're looking at something that's probably more important for understanding the subject. If we look at this table here, if we look at the top, these are the 4 Englishes: English, EAL, Englang, and literature. The top score shows you if you get this score raw, the scaled score that you will get is whatever is here. Okay, so if you were to get a 30 in English, you'd end up with a scaled score of 28. If you get a 30 in English EAL, you get a 29, so you scale up more than English mainstream. If you get a 30 in English language, you'll scale up. So the first 2, English and EAL, scale down if you get a 30, whereas in English language, it scales up. If you get a 30, you will end up with a 33, which is a better score than any of the other Englishes, okay? So the reason that the government scales subjects is because they think that some subject is harder, right? So if the hardest subject, for example, is specialist maths, except for languages, the hardest subject is specialist maths. It scales the most, which means that if you get a 40, it scales up almost 10 points. You'll almost get a scaled 50. So if you look at the scaling here, if you get a 50, you keep a 50 regardless. But if you get any of these scores, you'll see that English language scales the highest, okay? So this indicates to you that English language is actually the hardest English. So it's definitely the hardest, even harder than literature, which is the second hardest. But we'll get into what makes it hard and what actually is English language in just a second to work out if it's actually meant for that type of student. Because I would say that doing a harder subject doesn't necessarily mean you will do better in its scale, okay? So for example, some kids who do specialist maths and further maths get like a 30 in spec, which is a harder subject. It scales up a lot and they get maybe a 40, but maybe they just do incredibly well in further maths, which is the easiest maths, and they get a 45 raw. That's still a better score. So you pick the English that's meant for you. I'm just opening the idea of English language as a subject here because I think it's often overlooked. I'm not trying to convince you that everyone should do English language because it's definitely not the case that English language will work for everyone. But this scaling report just shows you that on average, it scales up a little bit more. So if you think you can get a 30 in it, you'll end up with a higher score than a 30 in English mainstream. The other thing about this is you'll notice that English EAL, so a second language English as an additional language, it actually scales more than mainstream. So here's another reason that if you qualify for English as additional language, make sure that you do that. Because some people don't realize, they think I'm second language, those people think that they are second language, but they think that they'll do better in English mainstream. This is not true. If you do EAL, it scales more. You will do better in EAL than in English mainstream if you qualify for it, okay? So if you've lived in Australia for less than 7 years is the qualification. Do English as an additional language, EAL, 100%. Otherwise, consider the other options. Okay, so the rest of this presentation now, we're going to be talking about what is English language, what type of student is good at English language, and should you do it, okay? That's the important question, okay? So what do you study in English language, okay? So if you do English language, you'll go through what we call 1-2 and 3-4. So when I talk about 1-2, just know that I'm talking about year 11, so the first year of VCE. When I talk about 3-4, I'm talking about year 12. So there's 4 units for every VCE subject. Units 1, 2, 3, and 4. 1, 2 are the first and second semesters of year 11. So what do you study in English language? Basically, you study the English language as a concept, okay? In English mainstream, you use English as a tool to get your ideas across, and you learn how to use English. But in English language, you actually study the English language, right? We're talking about what is language, right? How does the English language work, okay? So it's fundamentally different. 4 of the units I thought I'd quickly mention. These bottom 2, etymology and language acquisition, these are 2 of the units that you'll do in year 11. So these won't be assessed in your final score because only year 12 counts. These 2 are basically some of the things you'll study in year 11, okay? So etymology is typically unit 1, I think. So you'll study, if you do English language, you'll have to do 1, 2. So I'm sure some of you realize that some subjects, like for instance, biology in VCE, you can go straight into the 3, 4. English language, you definitely can't. If you want to do English language, you have to do the 1, 2. You have to do year 11 English language before you can do year 12. And the reason is that there's content that you have to know before you do year 12. Otherwise, they won't let you, but also you'll do very badly. You won't be able to keep up. It'll be too hard. So if you want to do it, you have to do it in year 11. You can't switch from mainstream to Englang. If you want to do Englang, you do it from the start, from the get-go. Okay, so in year 11, you'll learn about etymology, which is the history of languages. So like how languages change over time. It's a very interesting unit. And all these kind of things set you up for the type of writing that you do in year 12. Another unit you do is language acquisition. So this is specifically children. How do children learn language? That's what we look at here. So the stages that kids use when they learn a language, how it works, how kids actually pick up language. And we also compare this to second language learning. How is it different that kids learn a language to how adults learn a second language? So this is a very interesting unit. What you'll learn if you do English language, if your kids do English language, is that English language is really a science. So in VCE, there's 4 real sciences, biology, chemistry, physics, and psychology. English language is almost considered a science, especially if you were to do this kind of study beyond high school. And you'll really see that once you start doing this unit of language acquisition, you'll see that the way you study is you do experiments. So you don't do that many in class. I think you only do 1 experiment in year 12 and 1 in year 11. But you'll find that the way you actually study English language is very scientific, right? We break down languages into little bits. So yeah, this unit is about child language, how kids learn language. This unit is about etymology. The 3-4 unit, the one you'll do in year 12, is called identity. And it's about how humans use language to reflect how we feel about ourselves. So this is things like how our jobs, what job we have and how we change our language, what age we are and how we change our language. All those kind of identity features comes into the identity unit. And we compare it with language. So these are 3 examples of units, but fundamentally what you study in English language is the English language itself. So 90% of the work won't be any of these smaller units. It will be this top left one, meta language. This is a big word that means language that we use to describe other language. It's basically a whole list of ways that we can talk about English language, okay? So meta language is what you study almost all the time. Yeah, that's meta language. So I'll continue on to the next slide and I'll come back to how meta language is important. I'm actually going to do this slightly out of order. So I'm going to talk about this first. So this is what we study this is how we break down languages. I just wanted to give you a quick idea of how the kids will actually be studying if they do English language. So you'll learn that when we talk about languages, it's too hard to break down a language without smaller units, okay? So we discuss languages in terms of 5 subsystems, 5 areas of language that build up to create the whole English language, okay? This is also true for all languages, right? If you were to do linguistics later, you'd see that this is not just true for English. We can break up all languages like this. So the 5 units that the kids study in English language at VCE are this: phonology, the way that speech sounds, so that the oral qualities of language, how stuff sounds, okay? That's everything from specific words and sounds to accents. Okay, next we have syntax, sentences, right? The structure of sentences. Okay, so we look at how words work together to create meaning in a sentence. Okay, third, lexicology and morphology. This one is quite confusing, but it's words and the little parts of words. So for example, in the word cats, we have one word, the word cats, but we have two bits of meaning, the cat and the little S on the end. So that little S tells you that there's more than one cat. So that's what we call a morpheme. So when we study this later, we'll see that we can break all words down into little bits, okay? Yeah, so lexicology and morphology is think of it as like units of language, okay? Number 4, pragmatics and discourse analysis. So this one is how sentences, when you've got more than one, so lots of passages, or when people are talking to each other, how sentences build up. So the whole overview of how language works, right? This includes things like how people get meaning across using body language, how people, use like eye contact and stuff like that to get meaning across. So this is one of the really interesting areas of English language. And last one, number 5, is semantics, which literally means the meaning of words. Okay, so here we look at things like which words, how does meaning change? What words mean what? Do some words have like elevated meaning, which means like they're considered more advanced than others? We look at all this kind of ways of breaking down English. So just remember that we're basically studying English language itself. We're studying the English language, and we break it down like this into these 5 bits of it. We group it into 5 subsystems, smaller bits of language. Okay, cool. So I'm going back one slide to talk about the exam. Okay, so now we're getting into assessment, right? But for all Englishes, there is an exam, and some amount of your score will come from the stacks you do in class. So all scores for all subjects for VCE are the score you get is comprised of your stacks and then your exam. The important thing to remember is that your exam will scale your stacks. So let's say you get 80% on your stacks, so your in-school assessments, and then you get 100% on the exam, a very good score, the best score. Your SAC scores will actually increase. So VCAR, which is the body that manages VCE, the company that runs Victoria's school system, where they take your exam and they improve your SAC scores based on your exam. So this works on a school level. So if you go to a school that does very well on the exam, all of the kids' scores will get lifted from the SACs, okay? And if a school does not very well on the exam, their scores will get lowered. The reason they do this is because the VCAR can't control how schools make assessments. So VCAR can't control whether schools set really easy SACs or really hard SACs. So some schools will set very easy SACs, which means that everyone gets 90 and above. The SAC was very easy. That means that VCAR has to bring their scores down so that it's fair for everyone. So the way they do that is they scale the exam. The point I'm trying to make here is that the exam is worth more than half of your score. It's very important because it's worth 50% plus the amount that it will scale your SACs. So your first scores, the one you're already done with, the scores you've already completed, those assessments will get boosted by your exam. Okay, so those scores go up. Okay, so here's the exam. Here's what you study in the English language exam. Sections A and B are very similar. So it's in 3 sections. Section A is what we call the short answer. Okay. Section A is only worth 15 marks. So it's only worth 1/5 of the overall score. Okay. for the exam. It tests your meta language. So remember before I was talking about how most of what you study in English language is stuff related to these subsystems. So, all of the content in these is what you study mostly. That's what section A tests, how well you memorize the content, right? So for instance, things like nouns and verbs, like how well you memorize those words, okay? That's your short answer. Okay, moving on. These are the two big parts. I forgot to write down, but section C is also worth 30 marks. The whole exam is 2 hours, by the way, with 15 minutes reading time. The section B, the analytical commentary, worth 30 marks. This one tests your use of meta language, but what they do is they give you a text. So in short answer, they also give you a text. They give you a piece of writing. It will either be a speech, so something someone said out loud, or it will be a written document. And it can literally be anything. Okay, so sometimes it's a formal speech at like an event, but sometimes it's like something like a radio podcast or something like that. Section B is just like the short answer. You answer questions in the short answer, but section B, they don't give you any questions. You have to write the whole section by yourself. So you write something about 1 to 2 pages long based on the text. You analyze a text. So let's say they give you a formal speech. You analyze what's going on in the speech. You know, how are people interacting? What kind of language features do they use? So you're expected here to bring in your own meta language, okay? And the 3 really important parts of the analytical commentary, the 3 things you get assessed on that you have to talk about is context, which means like what's the situation in that the scene is taking place in. So if they're in a formal speech, like what's the context of the speech? Why are they using languages like this? The register, which is how formal it is. So a very formal speech might be like wedding vows or a speech from the president or, you know, a principal speaking, whereas an informal speech might be like a couple of friends speaking. So they use different language features. And the last one is SP, which is short for social purpose, which means the reason, what I'm trying to achieve with my language. So am I trying to make friends, or am I trying to like show that I'm very smart, or what am I trying to do with my language, right? So analytical commentary, you get a text and you have to analyze it by yourself, okay? Okay, section C, often the most talked about section is the essay, okay? Again, it's worth 30 marks. So these 2 sections, B and C, are the most important. And the essay tests your ability to think about language, okay? So here they'll give you a question, maybe about identity, for example, but there's a couple of types of questions they can ask you. And what you have to do is you have to bring in your own meta language altogether. So here you don't get a text at all. They don't give you a text to read. You have to answer a question with no source material. You bring all your own ideas into it. Typical essay questions are things like, to give you an example, maybe like, is language changing because of the internet, right? Is language changing because of the internet? That's a possible question. That's one that has come up before, okay? That's the essay. What you need to know about the essay for if you're trying to choose whether you should do English language or not, what you need to know is that the essay section, so when you're after school ends in term 3, so in VCE, term 3 is the last term for year 12s. Term 4 is what we call swap vac, which is when you get to study on your own. English language is a special subject. It requires that you study extra by yourself, okay? So English language is only suited to students who are self-determined, right? If a student is not going to study extra by themselves, they should not do English language, okay? If a student is willing to study beyond the material, they will do very well in English language and get a good score, okay? It's because of this essay part, section C. You're expected to bring all your own ideas and all your own references in. So think about it as like writing about a book except you don't get a book. You have to make up your own ideas, okay? It's all expected from you. You can't just wing this one. You can't just fly under the radar. You can't get away doing just listening in class and then just doing the essay. You have to study extra by yourself. So if I talk about what type of students I think should study English language, I'd say that typically kids who really like science and aren't very creative in terms of maybe like the humanities. So kids who prefer science and maths over art, history, etc. Those kind of students often do better on English language than they would do on English mainstream. So whilst English language still requires you to be a very fluent writer, you still have to be a good writer and be very good at English. It's suited for students who prefer a scientific way of thinking about English, okay? So I would say that English language is kind of like the science English, right? Think about it as the English where you think about language as a science instead of as a tool for writing essays, okay? So especially in the exam, you see that it's you memorize content and you don't think creatively, you think analytically, right? You're analyzing stuff. And I'll get more into that later. But fundamentally, I would say if you had to pick to do English language, you have to be willing to study extra beyond the course material, beyond what they teach you in class. You have to take extra time out at the end to study more if you want to do very well. If you want to say get over 35, if you want to get over 40 or 45, you absolutely have to study more at the end of the year. So during SWOTVAC, which you spell SWOTVAC, by the way, SWOTVAC, in case you haven't heard of it, is like that period of time in between the end of the school term and the exams. So like that extra study time that VCE students get.